Okay, let's take our Bibles together tonight to the book of Genesis. If you need a copy of the notes for tonight, just lift up your hands and or one of your hands. You can do both if that's right. For our Pentecostal friends, this is how you do it. Okay. For our Baptist friends, this is how you do it. Okay. All right, we're in Genesis here as we have been, for some time. But be encouraged, we're in the 30s now, okay? It's been 3 months, we're in the 30s. But actually, you know what? It's been 6 months, we're in the 30s. But we are going to look at some things here as we continue in the life of the patriarchs. So I've entitled tonight's lesson Down with the Patriarchs, Patriarchy. It's a big thing today, isn't it, the patriarchy? So what we have in the Bible here is we have God at work in the lives of three particular men through whom God was going to birth a new nation. Okay, everybody, so try not to look ahead. So God is working through three particular men as he is birthing a new nation, and what he's doing now is he's using these three men, not only their lives, but there's typology all the way through their lives, right? We've looked at that leading up, Abraham, Isaac, different things in their lives that are pointing to Jesus Christ. And then we get to the life of Jacob, and it's no different. Now, we know that through the patriarchs is going to come whom? Jesus Christ. So we know then that this was laid out in the garden when the Lord Jesus Christ gave that first messianic prophecy in chapter 3, okay, about the seed of the woman, right? So this now is pushing through the seed of the woman. Okay, that's what this is. These are the patriarchs. And so have you heard that expression, the biblical patriarchs? That is referring to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so what the devil has tried to do through the lives of the first two, and then certainly here in Jacob's life, is he's trying to destroy the life in some way of one of these men, because he knows that through these men will come the promised seed, okay? And so that's what's happening in Jacob's life particularly. And we'll look at that here tonight. So what I want to show you here as we get started, and yes, I have learned how to use AI, okay? Just because I know that all of our under 20s were asking me before church. So what I want you to see, the next slide, if you will, Brother George, is you look on your paper here. This is kind of where we've come up to from chapter 12 to 25, and actually even a little further than that. Notice that Abraham enters into Canaan about 1921 BC. You get down to Isaac's birth in 1896. We see the sacrifice of Isaac there. Then we see, of course, Isaac and Rebekah around 1856. Shem, by the way, if you notice that, Shem has died in 1846. Imagine how long that guy lived. All right, he died there. And then we have Jacob and Esau that come on the scene in 1836. It's not long after that Abraham dies. And then that part in red that you see there, that's kind of where we are in this story here tonight. Okay, so we have from Jacob and Esau and their birth and the events we looked at those last time. Remember, you have the birth of these guys, and then the story of their younger years, and then stealing the birthright, stealing the blessing, and off to Laban's Jacob flees, okay? So all of that is taking place in this period of red that you see on the chart here. So it just kind of helps you get some of the dates and the timeline a little bit in your mind, and you know where we are. So let's go ahead and turn the page and start tonight here in Genesis chapter number 29, if I didn't already tell you that. Genesis 29. You recall that the last time that we spoke, we looked at the fact that Jacob had served 7 years for who he thought was Rachel. Turns out it was the wrong woman. And then he had to fulfill her week. There was a week of ceremony and feasting that was commensurate with the wedding. And then after that, then he was given Rachel, the younger sister, with her maid. And from there you have nothing but strife in a good part of the rest of Jacob's life. And so God lays out some things. Now, this was not Jacob's fault, okay? This was Laban's fault. But God was using this in preparation for future events. So we're going to start here tonight in chapter number 29. And I've titled this section, The Baby Wars. All right, so chapter number 29, and if you drop down to verse 24, Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid for an handmaid. Just take note of that. Of course, we went through the whole wedding night and all the events that happened there. If you drop down to verse 29 of the same chapter, Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah, his handmaid, to be her maid. And so now you have the two wives and the two handmaids that enter into Jacob's orbit here. And what you need to know is that Jacob is now 77 years old when he starts serving Laban. He's already a fairly old man by today's standards. Of course, we know he lived a bit more time than that, but Jacob is 77 when he gets there and starts serving. And he's given, through the deception of Laban, he's given Leah and her handmaid Zilpah, and then he's given Rachel and her handmaid, and a handmaid for her, Bilhah. And so these are the ones that ultimately bear all of Jacob's children here. There's 13 years that go by, and I want you to look down verse number 31 of chapter 29. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bare a son and called his name Reuben. And she said, surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. It's a sad state of affairs, actually, when you read through the story of these two women and just the course of their life with their husband. Neither one of them asked for this. Jacob didn't ask for this. This was thrust upon him through Laban. But there's just such strife and conflict and unhappiness in the home. It's a study all in its own. But she names the firstborn son Reuben, and she says, maybe my husband will now love me. And so then verse 33, she conceived again, bare a son, and said, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son, and she called his name Simeon. Verse 34, she conceived again and bare a son. Now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I've borne him 3 sons. Now the joined unto me is not talking about their physical relationship. She's just saying, I want my husband to love me as his wife. And he doesn't. Remember now, Jacob still favored who? He still favored Rachel. Why did he favor Rachel? She was beautiful, right? So he was looking at the outward appearance. And I'm not saying that Jacob is so shallow he didn't care about the inside, but we'll learn a little bit later on here today that Rachel wasn't what she appeared to be on the outside. And so he loved her. There's no doubt. God says that he loved her. But he was attracted to her beauty, and Leah had something on the inside that Jacob couldn't see. So when she said here that maybe my husband will be joined to me, what she's saying is, I just want him to love and accept me as his wife, but he doesn't really see who I am. And so there's these 3 sons. She conceived again, bare a son, verse 35. Now will I praise the Lord. And she called his name Judah. Now in Rachel, verse 31, she saw that she bare Jacob no children, so she envied her sister, conflict. And she said, give me children or else I die. And he got mad at her, obviously. Verse 2, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld thee from the fruit of the womb? In other words, I can't do anything about this. And so what you have through chapter number 30, we're not going to read it all, but you get through most of chapter number 30, and this is now the wars between the wives. And they're competing for Jacob's affection and attention, and neither one of them are happy. Jacob is not happy. He spends more time with the sheep than he does with his wives. And it's just a mess in the home, okay? So over 13 years now, Jacob is serving Laban. And over that 13 years, he now has 11 sons and a daughter that's born to him in that period of time. Now you think about that's a whole lot of little kids in the space of 13 years, all right? Imagine the nappies if they had them back then. But he's got 2 wives that are now competing with each other for his love and affection. And these sons become now the 12 tribes of Israel. So if you'll notice on the sheet there, I've color-coded this so you can see in Genesis 29 and 30, these are who become the 12 tribes. So Leah gives the first 4, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And then remember, Rachel is barren at this point, so she gives her maid Bilhah, and Bilhah bears Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah gives her maid Zilpah, and so she bears Jacob, Gad, and Asher. And then Leah herself gets pregnant again, and she bears 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun. And then finally God hears Rachel's prayer and opens her womb and gives her Joseph and then Benjamin. So those are the 12 tribes of Israel there, okay? Color-coded for your convenience, but it helps you to know who's who. Talk about a confusing house. I mean, sometimes I forgot the 5 kids that I had. Imagine 12. How many of you parents know what I'm talking about if you have more than like 2 kids and one of them gets in trouble and you just go through the whole list of all of them before you get the right one? That's what we did, okay? So this is what takes place here. Now, if you drop down to the middle of chapter number 30, we're going to see now that, actually, let me just back up a second. Let me say something about the 12 tribes. You may not be familiar with the story that's coming here, but Reuben, the firstborn, later on here, when he gets to be an adult, Reuben commits sexual immorality, and Dad finds out about it, and because of his indiscretion, he lost his right as the firstborn, and so his inheritance was actually divided. Reuben's inheritance was divided between the 2 sons of Joseph, which we'll learn later on in the book of Genesis, which are Ephraim and Manasseh, okay? So that he actually loses his inheritance, and the 2 sons of Joseph split it. We know also Levi, if you go a little bit later into this book, in the book of Exodus, Levi was given the priestly line, remember that? And so because of that, he didn't have any land inheritance because the Lord was in his inheritance. So God splits that up later on. But initially, these are the 12 boys that become the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jacob has now been serving with Laban for a decade and a half. And we learned that Laban has changed his wages 10 times. Laban has been a dishonest employer, a dishonest father-in-law. And Jacob has borne that over all these years now, and he's borne the loss. Any loss that came to Laban's flocks were demanded of Jacob, and so Jacob took the hit, and Laban got the increase. And that's just the way it was with Jacob. So I want you to notice in chapter 30, when verse 25, it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, send me away that I may go into my own place and go into my country. Give me my wives, my children, from whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done for thee. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry. For I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. All right, it's fairly self-explanatory. And so he said, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. Now, this is a great thing. If you're looking for a job, and your employer comes to you and says, listen, just tell me what you want me to pay you. Wouldn't that be a great day, right? We'd all go work for that guy. But so he says, appoint me thy wages and I will give it. And Jacob said unto him, he said, thou knowest how I have served thee and how thy cattle was with me. For it was little which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now, when shall I provide for mine own house also? So, he's an old man now, and he's saying, I've got to take care of my family. I'm done with you, but I can't walk away empty. How am I going to do this? And so Laban says, verse 31, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. Here's what I want to do. I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and of such shall be my hire. And so shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. In other words, my righteousness will prove that if I'm ever called into question for my integrity about this thing, that I stole something from you, it's going to be obvious, because I'm telling you, give me all the speckled cattle and anything that's plain, a plain solid color, which is what they wanted, by the way. That was of greater value. Then you keep all the plain stuff, which was the greater number. It was a smaller number that would have been speckled. I'll take all the minorities, okay, the weaker minorities. You take the plain colored animals. And so he said, everyone, verse 33, that is not speckled or spotted among the goats and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. So he sets himself up with a great deal of integrity here and says, here's what my wages are. I'll take everything out of the herd that has spots and is discolored, and that'll be mine. But all the good stuff that's solid colored, that's yours. And it'll be obvious if I've stolen anything from you. You can't spray paint the sheep, right? I mean, it is what it is. So Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. In other words, that's a great deal. That's what Laban is saying here. This is a great deal. And so he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. He had a crazy-looking flock. That's what we're talking about here. And so he set 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Now you notice on your sheet there's this watering trough with these sticks and stuff that are in it here, okay? I want to talk to you for just a moment now about Jacob's unusual increase. There's something unusual that Jacob does here that even today we don't fully understand. But let me just give you some perspective on it, and we'll try to get the Lord's mind about what takes place here. So Laban asked Jacob, name your salary. And Jacob says, well, I'll just keep the sheep that have the markings and not the solid color. And Laban says, this is great. And so now, listen, at 90 years of age, Jacob is at least 90. That's pretty late in life to get into the cattle game, right? But here he is at least 90 years of age, and now he embarks upon what is a selective breeding program. And so it's interesting how far ahead of the curve Jacob is all these years ago, 4,000 years ago, to what we are today. There's things he understood about selective breeding that we've only just begun to figure out right now, okay? And so that's what this process is here. And obviously there's the apparent blessing of God upon what he does here, but he begins to grow this large herd for his own wealth. Now keep in mind, he made an arrangement with Laban, and Laban agreed to this, readily agreed, said, yes, I like this plan, all right? So Jacob is still involved in feeding Laban's crops, right? Isn't that what he said there? So he said in verse 31, if thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock, correct? So there's no dishonesty in Jacob. He says, listen, I'm going to tell you what I want you to do, and if you agree to this, I'll keep feeding your flocks, no problem. All right, so he separates all the ring-straked, spotted, speckled, all of that off to the side, and then he sets 3 days' journey between him and this. So there's no mixing, okay? 3 days' journey between these. And so now you have all of Laban's flocks, which is by far the greater number of animals. And their solid color, they would bring a greater price if they were sold. So they have more value than all of these over here. And so Jacob takes all of these off to the side. So now keep in mind now, Jacob now has fed Laban's flocks now for quite a long time, more than 14 years at this time. In the lead up to Jacob coming to Laban, before he fled his father, he was also caring for his father's Isaac's sheep and cattle in the family farm. So Jacob now has been dealing with animals all of his life. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what he was doing, okay? So the indication here, notice what he does. Verse 37, and Jacob took him rods of green poplar. You know what a poplar is? And it's got thin sticks, like probably no bigger than your finger. Some are smaller than that, just coming out of this tree. So he took these trees and he peeled these white strakes. In other words, if you've ever done this, I did this growing up. You take a knife and whatever, and you're kind of like carving wood, you know? But a little bit of that skin of that poplar will kind of come loose, and you can peel it off. And you can peel strips down and so you're looking at a green stick with a white stripe in it because you've just peeled the strip of the outer layer of that skin off, okay? That's essentially what Jacob is doing here. So he does this. He said, and of hazel and the chestnut tree, verse 37, and he peeled white strakes in them, and he made the white appear, which was in the rods. And then he set the rods, which he had peeled, before the flocks in the gutters and the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink. It says that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods and brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. So the indication here is that by doing this and creating the white strips in these stakes that were in the troughs when the cattle came to drink, the indication is that in some way this would promote breeding when the animals were in heat. Anybody who knows anything about animals understands what in heat is all about. It's just a process that an animal goes through, a cycle where they're ready to conceive, okay? So he waits for that time, and then he puts the rods into the watering troughs because all of the animals are going to go to the trough, okay? You're not checking under the tail to find out if it's a boy cow or a girl cow or whatever. They just all come to drink at the trough. And so when they're in heat, then they come in and they see this. So what he did was Jacob selected, we'll just actually read this here. The flocks conceived, verse 39, before the rods, and they brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-straked and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and he put them not unto Laban's cattle. And it came to pass whenever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and men servants, and camels, and asses. So what he did was Jacob selected the animals that had certain dominant traits. Okay, if you know anything about cattle, whether in the Bible, cattle doesn't necessarily just refer to a cow. It could be a cow, a goat, a sheep. Okay, so Laban had cattle of all sorts, and he was looking for dominant traits in the animals. And you can see an animal that has weaker traits and an animal that has stronger traits. You might look at the flanks and the hind quarter and parts of the animal that look more muscular and firm, and you can tell that has a stronger muscular structure than another animal. So if you see a more feeble animal, what Jacob did was he didn't put the rods in the trough for those feeble animals. He let them just go drink water, but there were no rods. But when he saw the stronger animals, he put them over here, and he made them drink out of a trough that had these sticks in them that had the whites in there. So we don't know what it was about the coloring of these sticks. There's no magical properties in the sticks, okay? But it was something that that maybe kicked the breeding cycle in, or kicked them into heat, or something along those natures. Again, processes that we don't fully understand today, but Jacob obviously understood at that time. So he bred the animals together that had dominant traits. That's what he did. And over time, that produced a large herd of speckled and spotted cattle, which we just read about here. They were strong and healthy. Now, many, many years later, only about 100 and something years ago, there was a man who started to figure this out. And we've called this now Mendelian genetics, okay? And this was a guy who figured out using pea plants processes of selective breeding. It's genetics in plants. And they realized over time, he realized over time by breeding plants together, that you could create dominant, stronger types of plants by crossbreeding, okay? And so because of that, they got to thinking, well, wait a minute. If this works in the plant world, maybe this works in the animal world. And so they began selective breeding inside the animal world and found out it's exactly the same thing. When you crossbreed dominant animals in some way, you get a dominant, a mix that has the traits that you're looking for. And that's what Jacob was doing. He was looking for stronger animals. So the weaker animals, he didn't put the sticks in. The stronger animals he did, and they conceived before that, okay? So let me just give you a snapshot definition of Mendelian genetics so you understand what Jacob was doing here. When mating occurs between two organisms of different traits, each offspring exhibits traits of one parent only, okay? One parent only. If the dominant factor is present in the offspring, the dominant trait will result. So each parent may have different types of genetics. Are you with me? But when they breed together, the animal that comes, that's born, will have the dominant trait of one of the two parents. And that's what Jacob was doing. So the dominant trait was a stronger animal that was speckled. And so when that happened, then he put that stronger speckled young calf or cow off to the side, and the weaker solid color animal he put off to the side, and he only began to breed the stronger ones with the stronger ones. And if the resulting offspring were speckled and from the stronger dominant parent, then those got put off to the side, you understand? And so through a process of time, using these genetics, Jacob figured out how to grow his cattle. So Laban still increased, but he didn't increase at the rate that Jacob increased with his cattle. And the corresponding flocks were weaker on Laban's side and much, much stronger on Jacob's side. Now, that's pretty cool. I don't know how many times I've read that, by the way, over my life and tried to figure out what in the world does this mean, right? Have you ever done that? You read this thing? If you're a cow farmer, you're trying to figure out what the formula is, right? You're peeling sticks and throwing them in the troughs, hoping something happens. Now, as this happens over time, I want you to notice at the end of chapter 30, the man increased exceedingly, as you would expect. So over time, he increases, and he had cattle, maidservants, men servants, camels, and asses. Notice chapter 31, verse 1, he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father he hath gotten all this glory. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. Okay, now we have a problem. Because the sons of Laban get angry, and Jacob realizes it's time to wrap this thing up and go home. All right, I've been here long enough, right? When you got the in-laws mad at you, I mean, it's bad enough when your father-in-law is mad at you. Imagine your mother-in-law, right? And so here he is, and he's like, I got to get out of here. And so it begins the process in chapter 31 now of Jacob saying, I've got to go away. Now remember chapter 30 and verse 25. It came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go into my own place into my country. He had already told his father-in-law, I want to leave. And Laban said, well, not yet. And so Jacob continues on for a season and grows even larger. And then when the countenance of the sons and Laban turns against him, he realizes things have soured. They think I stole daddy's flocks. And he didn't actually do that. But he did get wealthy and increased from Laban's flocks. And so now it's time for him to return home. And so notice in chapter 31 and verse number 17, if you were to go the rest of, actually, let me have you do verse 3. Chapter 31, verse 3. The Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. Okay, so he sees Laban is angry at him, and then God says to Jacob, it's time for you to go home. Okay, so then the next verse, verse 4, he sends for his wives, and for several verses here, he just explains, hey, listen, ladies, we're leaving dad, okay? Time for you to pack your stuff, get your Tupperware in a suitcase, we're headed back to Canaan. And so he lets them know, and he explains all of what's taken place over these years. And then it says in verse 17, Jacob rose up, he set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle, goods, which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Padan Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan, chapter 31. So I want you to notice now that Jacob is now going to return home. So what I've said about this is Jacob sneaks out. When you read the chapter, he actually sneaks out. Notice it says, verse 19, Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. You know what those are, right? These are little pocket gods. Laban was an idolater, and he had these little gods. And so whatever they would have been little things that he worshipped, which was not uncommon in the Bible. If you read through the book of Judges, you find that takes place in Judges as well, okay? So Laban was an idolater. Rachel stole the images that were her father's. Bad idea. But Jacob didn't know about it. And so it says, Jacob, verse 20, stole away unawares from Laban the Syrian. Does this remind you of anything? 20 years ago, Jacob did exactly this thing to his brother. Okay? 20 years ago, this exact scenario plays out when Jacob leaves daddy's house and steals away because Esau says, I'm going to kill you. And so he sneaks away, right, and runs away to Laban. And now here 20 years later, we're back on repeat. And so Jacob now sneaks out, round two, and heads out, and he's headed back to his father Isaac. The Bible tells you now that he moves away, and in verse number 23, he took his brethren with him. Oh, I beg your pardon, verse 21. He fled with all that he had, and he rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. And it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. So Jacob's been on the road for 3 days. Now, you're not traveling very far and fast when you're on a camel, right? So he's got his whole family on camels and whatever. They're moving pretty slow. But 3 days go by. You can cover some distance in 3 days before Laban hears about it. So it says that Laban, verse 23, took his brethren with him, pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. So they have now been on the road for quite a while here in days, and Laban now catches up. Now Jacob has got a real quandary here, because if you know the story here, then Jacob now is really between two enemies. He faces an enemy from behind, which is Laban, and Jacob has the fear of an enemy that's in front of him. Who's that? That's Esau. He's afraid of his brother. He knows he's going to come back to his own land, and he's afraid his brother's going to kill him. So now Jacob finds himself between two enemies, doesn't he? And but he did this to himself. He ran away. And so Laban catches up to him. Jacob's afraid of what's in front, and Jacob's afraid of what's behind. But notice how God intervenes here. Verse 24 of chapter 31. Do you see that there? And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said unto him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Okay, what does that mean? Be completely neutral. In other words, God's saying, you better be careful. Okay, be careful. Now, God had said to Jacob, it's time for you to go home. Jacob left without saying goodbye. Okay, he shouldn't have done that. I think he was afraid of what Laban was going to do. Laban didn't want him to leave. But nevertheless, Jacob caused some of this problem. But God intervenes and says to Laban, you better be careful what you do with Jacob. And so Laban catches Jacob 7 days later with an armed force from his own household, but God obviously had intervened. So notice then, secondly, then what takes place. Jacob, verse 25, had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What hast thou done that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, carried away my daughters as captives taken with the sword? Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly and steal away from me, and didst not tell me that I might have sent thee away with mirth and songs and tabret and with harp?" I have a strong doubt that Laban would have done that, right? But that's what he said. "And thou hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and daughters. Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. It's in the power of my hand to do you hurt, but the God of your father, spake unto me yesternight, saying, Take heed thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And now, though thou wouldst needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods?" Now you can imagine Jacob, he's kind of copping it for running away. Okay, he's probably accepting this from Laban as, I probably should have said goodbye. But then this, "And where did you steal my gods? Why did you steal my gods?" Now, Jacob is not an idolater. Never has been. Jacob served the one true God, the God of his father. He knew who God was. And so Laban says, "Why did you steal my gods?" And Jacob says, "Okay, listen, I was afraid," verse 31, "because I figured you'd take your daughters by force." But he says, verse 32, "With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live." Hey, I was afraid you weren't going to let your daughters go. But listen, as concerning these idols, I'm not an idolater. Have a look around. You find somebody in my group that has your idols, kill him. It wasn't me. I didn't steal your gods. And it says, "Before our brethren," verse 32, "discern what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them." Here we have the hidden idolater in his wife. This is what I call Rachel's dark side. He didn't know this about his wife. She's an idolater. She steals her father's gods. Now, what a story. Have you read this story? What a story. So Laban, verse 33, went into Jacob's tent. Might as well start at the top, right? Went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the two maidservants' tent, but he found them not. And then went he out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tent, but found them not. And she said to her father, "Let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me." And he searched, but found not the images. Now she steals her father's gods. She hides them in her tent. She sits on them. And listen, just to be plain here, she uses her monthly cycle as an excuse not to stand up. The custom of women is upon me. In other words, I'm not feeling great, Dad. I'm just gonna have to stay here if you just don't mind. Search around me, okay? And she uses that as an excuse to hide the images. Now, no doubt this gives rise to the expression, "Beauty is skin deep, but ugly goes to the bone," right? And Rachel was a beautiful woman, but she was ugly on the inside. She was an idolater. And so Jacob didn't know that. Now, I don't even know whether Jacob ever knew that. There's no indication. But God reveals that this is what takes place. So now, Jacob gets angry. I mean, rightly so. Verse 36, he was wroth and he chode with Laban. He said, "What is my trespass?" And on he goes, okay? So they have this long conversation. And Jacob rightly accuses Laban of injustice in their relationship. And so Laban says in verse 43, "These daughters are my daughters, these children are my children, these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto my daughters or unto their children which they have borne? Now, therefore, come thou, let's make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee." And so it says that Jacob now takes a stone, and he sets it up, verse 45, as a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, "Gather stones." And they took stones, they made a heap. And they did eat there upon the heap. I mean, why not? So Laban calls it whatever that word is, and Jacob calls it Galid. So this was called a heap of witness in both the Chaldean, I think it is, and then also in Hebrew. So Laban said, "This heap is a witness between me and you," and it was called Galid. And Mizpah, verse 49, "For the Lord watch between me and thee when we're absent one from another." So Laban threatens him. Okay, if you're looking on, "Hey, listen, if you afflict my daughters or take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us. In other words, the deal is off. If I hear you've taken another wife or you treat him badly, I'm coming over this pile of stones and I'm going to get you. That's basically what he says to Jacob. And Jacob's not a problem. He has no problem with that. And so verse 54, Jacob offers a sacrifice upon the mount. And he called his brethren to eat bread. They did eat and tarried all night in the mount. So notice then that Jacob makes a pact of peace with Laban. And then look at verse 55. I laugh when I read this. Look at 55. And early in the morning, Laban rose up, kissed his sons and his daughters, and blessed them. And Laban departed and returned unto his own place. The reason I laugh is Laban kissed everyone in the house except for Jacob. And said, I'm out. And Jacob goes his way, and Laban goes back home, and he goes his way. Now, if you turn the next page, and let's look just briefly here at the map of the journey. I think it helps you to understand when you look at a map. So on the top right there, you can't see it there, but Haran is in the top right where that red line goes off the map on the top. That's where he started out from, and he kind of comes down this direction, and then you see Mahanaim, which is coming up here in just a moment, and then Jacob's journey across into Succoth, and then eventually over into Shechem. So this is kind of the route that he takes from Mesopotamia into the land of Canaan, because remember now, he had said, I want to go back and see Isaac, my father. So Jacob now crosses from Mesopotamia over into Canaan. Look at chapter 31 and verse number 52. This heap be witness, that this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar to me for harm. And so this pile of stones gets put up here as a pillar, as a reminder of their witness. And it's almost like crossing the date line. Jacob crosses over the top of this and enters now into the land of Canaan. All right, so let's move on then. The journey continues. He's on his way back to see his father. And some things happen along the road. Now, if you've looked at Jacob's traveling, if you wanted to have an adventure, just travel with Jacob. Everywhere Jacob has traveled, he's had quite an adventure. Remember on the way across, we dealt with this several weeks ago. Remember on the way across, he was like day one, and he sees a ladder going up into heaven. Do you remember that? Angels of God ascending and descending. I mean, this is day one. Can you imagine all the things that Jacob saw? God speaks to him. God appears to him along the journey. Now here they are on the reverse. He's on his way back to Canaan, and the adventure continues. All right, so Jacob now meets God. And notice that the angels of God are going to meet him here at this place called Mahanaim. And so verse 1 of chapter 32, and Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's host. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which we'll look at here in a minute. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother, unto the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, thus shall ye speak to my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now, and I have oxen, asses, flocks, men servants, women servants, and I've sent to tell my lord that I might find grace in thy sight. So he sends a crew to his brother, find Esau. Now, Esau's not a hard guy to find. He's big and hairy, okay? He's bright red hair. You can't miss the guy. So everybody knows where Esau is. So the messengers go off, and they say, listen, Jacob sent us to tell you, I've been away for a while, and I'm coming back, and God's really blessed my life. And I just wanted you to know that I'm coming back so that I could find grace in your sight. What's he asking here? Don't kill me. That's the concern. Don't kill me, all right? And so the messengers come back in verse 6. They said, we came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee with 400 men with him. Okay, this is called fear factor. You just went from like a fear factor of maybe 4 or 5 to a straight 10, okay? This is why they invented blood pressure medication. It happened right here. This is the point. So we're going to back up here a minute, and we're going to look at the fact that the angels of God meet him. Now, they meet him at a place that God says is called Mahanaim. That means two hosts. That word means two hosts. Now, guys, listen. Everywhere in the Bible has meaning. And names in the Bible have meaning. We don't attribute meaning to names anymore today. But in God's economy, names have meaning, whether names of places or names of people. So Mahanaim means two hosts. And it signifies not only God's protection of Jacob, but also the fact that Jacob himself has a small, but he's got his own host but God's host, if you will, is greater than Jacob's host. So this place, Mahanaim. And so what he does is he fears because of what Esau is going to do. Esau's got 400 men. So Jacob prays in verse number 9, and I'm telling you, this is a prayer. Oh God. See that? Verse 9? He says, oh God. He's not swearing. Okay, this is a petition to God. Oh God, help me. This is where prayer really comes in. Drop down to verse 11. Deliver me from my hand to my brother. Verse 11. For I fear him. He's going to kill me. But listen, the mother with the children. It's not just me. He's going to kill my wives and my kids. And so he lodged there that night. And then it says, verse 13, that he took a present for Esau, his brother. And then it goes through goats and ewes and rams and camels and all the rest of it. He delivered them, verse 16, into the hand of his servants, every drove by themselves. So each grouping of animals, the camels by themselves, the donkeys by themselves, okay, all in droves. And he sends them out. Verse 16, pass over before me and put a space betwixt drove and drove. So this group and then a little bit of a space, and then the sheep come next, and then the cows come next, and you get the picture. And he commanded the foremost, the very first guy, saying, verse 17, when Esau my brother meeteth thee and asketh thee and saying, whose art thou, and whither goest thou, and whose are these before thee? Thou shalt say, these be thy servant Jacob's, it's a present sent to my lord Esau, and behold, he's behind us. And so every drove, verse 19, he commanded the second and the third, and all that followed, on this manner shall you speak to Esau. So he's hoping that a gift will assuage the anger of his brother, who he has no doubt is trying to kill him after 20 years. He's still angry. You stole my blessing and you stole my birthright, right? And Jacob comes back into the land, and he says, if I can just give him some presents, and he does. So imagine, in our economy today, this is like, I'm going to send you a check for $1,000, and then the next day I'm going to deposit $10,000 in your bank account, and then the next day, a Maserati, and please don't kill me. That's what's happening. And if he asks, well, what are these? Then tell him, well, it's a present to you from Jacob. He's coming. And then Esau will get to the next drove, and he'll ask, well, what are these? Oh, it's a present from Jacob, and he's coming. And maybe by the time Esau gets to Jacob, he won't be mad. Okay, that's kind of the plan. So he sends not only all of this, but he also sends his family across the river in bands, in groups, along with the gifts for his brother. Notice in verse 22, he rose up that night and he took his 2 wives and his 2 women servants and his 11 sons and passed over the ford Jabbok, and he took them and sent them over the brook, and he sent over all that he had. So he sends all of these together along with his family with gifts for Esau. Now, we'll keep your finger here, and I want you to go with me to Hosea chapter 12. Hosea chapter 12, if you will. If you can find that in your Bible. Hosea chapter number 12. I didn't mean that as a dig, by the way. Hosea chapter 12, and look at verse number 2. The Lord hath also a controversy with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways, according to his doings will he recompense him. He took his brother by the heel in the womb. Now we're talking about Jacob, verse 2. Okay, he took his brother by the heel in the womb. Now we all know that story, right? It says, and by his strength he had power with God. Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him. He found him in Bethel, and there he spake with us. Even the Lord of God of hosts, the Lord is his memorial. Okay, so notice what it says about Jacob. This spans actually longer in Jacob's life than just our event today. But our event today is mentioned here, where it says here that by his strength he had power with God. Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed. And then it says he wept and made supplication unto him. Okay, go back with me to Genesis then, where we were in chapter number 32. So now Jacob has sent the presents. Jacob has now sent his wives and all of his children over this ford. A ford doesn't necessarily mean a river. A ford can mean just a valley that divides 2 areas. But he sends everybody across. And now look at verse number 24. Chapter 32 of Genesis, verse 24. And Jacob was left alone. And then there's this strange phrase. And there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of that place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. He limped. He had a limp. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrunk. All right, so let's talk about this story for just a minute now. The angels of God now meet Jacob. Notice in chapter 32 again in verse 1, and Jacob went on his way. Notice this, and the angels of God met him. So who was the initiator of that? Well, it was the angels of God that initiated that conversation, okay? So he's met here at this place of two hosts, and God is now going to teach Jacob some lessons here that I think are important. So Jacob wrestles with God in verse number 24. Now, the first thing we need to understand, if you're looking in verse 30, I have seen God face to face. So we know that though it says he wrestled with an angel, who did he wrestle with? Jesus Christ, the pre-incarnate Christ. So in your Bible, oftentimes in the Old Testament, you'll see the angel of God. Sometimes it's in reference to an angel, and sometimes it's in reference to God himself in the flesh. And in this case, although he's called an angel here, he's also called God in the flesh, God face to face. So context is key in everything in the Bible, and the context will reveal what it's talking about. Here, we're talking about this particular angel happens to be the pre-incarnate Christ. Now, not only did this happen, now listen to me, not only did this happen, this is not a story. Okay, this is not a parable that teaches a truth. This is an event that God is recording for us, okay? So don't spiritualize it, don't allegorize it. This is an event that takes place. But not only did this happen in reality, but it also teaches us now the greatest lesson in prayer outside of the Garden of Gethsemane. There's some tremendous lessons in prayer that we learn, okay? The greatest lesson in prayer, you can just make a note in your Bible right here, Luke chapter 18 and verse number 1. Men ought always to pray and not to faint. That parable in Luke 18 about the unjust judge is the perfect match meet to this passage in Genesis. Now, listen, keep in mind that leading up to this, let's get the context. The day before this right here, Jacob falls on his face before God and says, "Oh God, deliver me from my brother. I'm afraid he's going to come kill us." So he had sent the messengers come back. He said, we're going to die. Oh God, deliver. So he spends that day and he gets everybody lined up and he starts sending them out and sending them out and sending them out. And now Jacob's finally left alone. I mean, this is a context here. And now he's alone. This has been this matter of prayer. I'm seeking God. I've just sent my wives out. What's going to happen to my wives? I'm the last man standing. Maybe when I step across, and maybe if I happen to meet my brother, by the time he gets to me, he won't be angry anymore. Maybe he won't kill my family, even if he comes after me. So there's an attitude of prayer here in this whole context of Jacob speaking to the Lord. And you know, what started on his knees in prayer ends up in physical conflict. I don't know how it happened. God doesn't tell us more than he just tells us the story, okay? So, but I know this, that all those years ago, that the one he saw at the top of the ladder is now looking at him face to face on the ground. And he grabs a hold of him. And they have a literal wrestling match. Now, Jacob knows who he's wrestling with. How do we know that's true? Okay, we just read Hosea 12. Weeping and supplication to God. Jacob knows this is God. And you can picture, he grabs a hold of God. He'd been on his knees in prayer, but now he sees him, his eyes see him. And he grabs a hold of him, he says, oh God, help me. I'm not letting go. Oh God, help me. Okay? That's what's taking place here. Now, this is all done by the Lord on purpose. He's allowing this to happen because there's something Jacob needs to know in this process. And he's weeping, and supplication is, I'm asking you to do something. Help me. Okay, that's what this is. So Jacob is getting a hold of it. They're not angry with each other. Jacob's not mad at the guy, you know. It's not like he's having a bad day and he finds the first guy he can and grabs him and throws him on the ground. This is Jacob grabbing a hold of who he knows to be God, and he's crying and saying, oh, God, help me. I'm going to die. My family's going to die here, okay? He was weeping and begging God. And so what was he weeping for? Well, obviously he was fearful of his own life. He just said that. He's going to smite me, verse 11. Now, he's afraid for his own life, but he's also afraid for his family. And God wrestles with him for quite a long time until the breaking of the day. Now, listen, I don't know if any of you were in wrestling. When I was in high school, I was a wrestler, and not a very good one, but I did it. And I tell you what, it is a highly physical sport. It is intense. And you're just in a short, several-minute wrestling match with somebody, and you are wiped out. I mean, because you use every ounce of your strength, and there is no time in a match where you can let your guard down or you're going to get stuck, okay? So you're talking about this intensity, and it says he wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. I don't know how long that was, but that was a long night for Jacob. He gets a hold of God and won't let him go. But God is trying to teach Jacob something here, and here's what he's trying to teach him. He's trying to teach Jacob that the purposes of God are more important than the purposes of Jacob. Okay, so step back with me for a minute. When we get the macro, the big picture of this whole event in Jacob's life, Jacob is one small piece of God's great puzzle. I should probably say God's great plan is a better way to put it. Jacob is just one piece in God's plan. It started with Abraham. It started way back with Abel, okay? But in Jacob's more recent life, it started with his grandfather and then his father. And Jacob has already had more than one time where God directly appeared to him and reassured him of his promise that God's plan for Abraham and Isaac also pertained to Jacob. So God is saying to Jacob, you think that your life is more important than everything else, and I want you to understand you're not a regular man. I have set you apart, your family apart, in my lineage, and I'm going to do something through your family that I promised, 1,800 years ago in the garden. Jacob, this isn't about you. This is about my plan. But Jacob couldn't see it. So Jacob is weeping for the wrong thing. He's afraid, but he doesn't have to be afraid. Why doesn't Jacob have to be afraid? Because God has told him more than one time, I will be with you. When he left Laban in this very chapter, God said, it's time for you to go, Jacob. We read the verse together. And he said, I will be with thee. I'm going to bring you safely in because, why? You're going to have sons, and your sons are going to become a great nation. In other words, Jacob, I've got something for you to do in your life. Don't worry about what looks like it's a danger to you. I've got a plan for you. So what God is doing for Jacob here is teaching him, my purposes are greater than yours. And he needed to learn that. So he says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And God does, but God injures him at the same time. Now I want you to notice it says, he prevailed not against him, so he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of his thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. So there's a sinew inside of here that shrunk in Jacob, and it made him limp. It made him lame. I mean, obviously he could walk and still function, but he had a limp that went with it now. And I think there's a principle there, right? God gives him a disability. His encounter with God that changed his life left him with something he would never forget. And I can tell you there's some spiritual principles that we could deal with here when it comes to prayer, but anybody who's ever prayed, and I mean really prayed, has walked away from that encounter marked by God, and he'll never forget it. Okay? It's not an injury. Do you understand the principle I'm making here? It's not that there's an injury there. It's just that when you know how to prevail in prayer with God and getting a hold of God, and any man or woman can pray this way before the Lord, but it takes intensity, fervency, discipline, sacrifice, deliberation, okay? But when you pray that way and supplicate and beg God and you get a hold of God, it will leave you with a mark. And you may be the only one that understands that about your life, but it will leave an impression on you that will be there for the rest of your life. So that's what happens. And God says, now, what's your name? Now, God doesn't ask Jacob because God doesn't know. He says, tell me your name. So read it that way in your mind. Hey, tell me your name. Jacob. Now, what does Jacob mean? It means supplanter, deceiver. Esau said, hasn't his name rightly been given Jacob? He stole the birthright. He stole the blessing. He supplanted. Okay? And God says to Jacob, what's your name? And Jacob says, it's Jacob. God said, oh, no, it's not. You've changed. I'm changing you. You're not the supplanter anymore. He said, your name is, verse 28, Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and has prevailed. You know what Israel means? God prevails. No wonder the world hates that nation. But that's what the word means. God prevails. It's the first mention of Israel in the Bible, is right here, obviously. Did you know it shows up another 2,295 times in the Bible? God has something to say about this nation, okay? But it started right here. So the day dawns. We're almost done here tonight. So the day dawns on a different man, doesn't it? Look at verse 31. He passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. When the day broke upon a different man. You see, once Jacob realized his own frailty, once he realized his own disability, God was finally able to bless him. And he carried that the rest of his life. So Jacob now is on his way home. So let's finally get to where Jacob gets home, okay? And then we'll finish off our study tonight. Chapter 33 and verse number 1. So Jacob now has had a long night, right? But he lifts up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And now we have this reunion. And so it says that Esau ran to meet him, verse 4, and embraced him and fell upon his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And they both weep, and they have a joyful reunion. Verse number 9, Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. And they go back and forth on this typical Eastern culture here when it comes to giving of gifts and all of that. And so Esau said in verse 15, hey, let me at least leave some of the folk that are with me with you, so that you can pass on. And Jacob said in verse 15, what needeth it? In other words, no, there's no purpose in it. Let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. So Esau goes home. They have a reunion, but Esau goes back, and Jacob moves on his own journey here. So Jacob has now been away for 20 years. And God now has answered Jacob's prayer, and they have this great and joyful reunion. They embrace and kiss each other and weep together. Does this remind you of something that takes place at the end of the book of Genesis? Same scenario with Joseph and his brothers, okay? Almost an identical scenario here. Now, moving on, chapter 35, turn over here. There are significant events that take place in Jacob's life. We're going to skip some of those for sake of our study here. Chapter 35, a bit of time goes on now. He's back in the land. He spends some time now in a place called Succoth and Shechem, and then God now is going to move him to a particular place. God said unto Jacob, chapter 35, arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make there an altar unto God that appeared unto thee when thou fledst from the face of Esau thy brother. All right, so now God moves him, and he says, I want you to go to Bethel. Now keep in mind, guys, when you remember what had taken place prior to this. Remember now Jacob on his way to Laban. Do you remember that story? He's fled from his brother, and he's on his way to Laban, okay? And he goes to Bethel, and he sees God there. And remember, he makes some vows to God. Do you remember that? At Bethel. This was 20 years ago. Okay, so now Jacob is on his way. And if you picture that map that I just gave you a little bit ago, where Jacob's on his way, Jacob never intended here to go back to Bethel. He was going to pass on by. He's at Succoth and Shechem, and he's passing by, and God says, oh, Jacob, stop. Go to Bethel. Go up to Bethel, okay? So from where Jacob is, God says, I want you to go up to Bethel. Now, it's only about 15 miles from where he is in Shechem to Bethel. So it's not very far in distance, but when God says go up to Bethel, he means that because it's 300 meters higher in elevation. He's got to climb to get up to Bethel, all right? So for 15 miles, Jacob is climbing 300 meters in elevation. He gets to the top up there. It's where it all started with him when he left home the first time. And now Jacob is confronted with something. Now, hear me tonight. Jacob is confronted with his lack of faithfulness to God in the thing that he told God 20 years ago. There is something Jacob told God 20 years ago in this spot, and God said to Jacob, before you see Dad, you're going to go back and revisit what you said to me because you haven't done what you told me you were going to do. So God sends him back to Bethel here. Now, I want you to look with me at chapter 28, just so we can refresh our memory about this event, okay? So go back to chapter 28 and drop down now to verse 20 at the end of the chapter. Jacob now vows this vow. Look at verse 20 of chapter 28. Jacob vowed a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in the way that I go and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall, number one, the Lord be my God. Number two, and this stone which I have set for a pillar should be God's house. Number three, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth to thee. So Jacob says three things he's going to do for God if God is with him, gives him food and clothing, and allows him to come back to Dad's house in peace. Okay, now go back to chapter 35. Let me ask you some questions. We've been through Jacob's life to this point with Laban, correct? Okay, has Jacob had food to eat for 20 years? Yeah, and he's had clothes to wear. I mean, he's probably not naked. There's no indication, right? Okay. Has he come to his father's house in peace? Now, he hasn't seen Isaac yet, but he's already passed through Esau. Remember, his greatest fear was Laban behind him, Esau in front of him. God took care of Laban, and God has just now taken care of Esau. So now Jacob has no enemies, correct? So everything he told God, God, if you do this, this, and this, then I will do this, this, and this. God has lived up to his part of the bargain. But the question is, has Jacob lived up to his part of the bargain? That's the question we've got to ask ourselves. And that's why God sent him back to Bethel. Okay, he has avoided going to Bethel again. I mean, ostensibly, when you think about it, because he knows he hasn't kept his promises to God. He made a vow, and he hasn't kept the vow. Okay, his household still had idolatry. Look in this very chapter, chapter 35. Jacob said to his household and to all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you and be clean and change your garments. Now, Jacob said, you're going to be my God. If you do this for me, then you're going to be my God. In other words, you're going to be central to my household. I'm the head of my household. I'll make sure you're the God of my household. And he didn't live up to the bargain. He's been married for 20 years. And he's got this large household. And there's still idolatry in his own house. So he hasn't kept his part of the bargain. Whatever he meant by this place will be God's house, he hadn't lived up to that part of it because there's still just a pile of rocks there. So whatever it is that he said he was going to do about that, there was still no house that was built, no tabernacle or whatever the case is that Jacob thought that he would do for God. That still didn't exist. And there was certainly no indication anywhere leading up to this point that he'd ever given a tenth of anything to God. But isn't that what he said to God? And of all that thou hast given me, I'll give tenth to thee. So the three things that he told God he would do, he hasn't done one of them yet. So I just want you to see the grace of God here. That's all I'm trying to show you. God says, Jacob, I've done everything that you asked me to do. And I've brought you back now, and when you went there, it was just you and you had nothing. And you've come away, and look at all that I've done for you. Your huge extended family, all your men servants and maid servants, all of the wealth that you're traveling with. Jacob, I did all of that for you. What have you done for me? And then you would dare to pass by the hill where you made that vow. I mean, not even looking at it as we go by. Because you know in your heart you haven't lived up to your promise. Jacob, get to Bethel. Go up. Because there's some things you need to face up there. And so he makes Jacob go back. And I just think that's the grace of God at work in Jacob's life. Jacob, I'm reminding you of the promise that you made to me so that you can get this thing right with me. And when he does that, look at verse number 9 of this chapter. And God appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padanaram, and he blessed him. And he said, Thy name is Jacob. Thy name shall not be called any more Jacob, but Israel shall be thy name. And he called his name Israel. I am God Almighty, he said. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come of thy loins. And the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed after thee will I give the land. You understand what God is doing? When Jacob finally gets this thing right and faces his own failure, there's no rebuke from God here. It's just the grace of God that brings him here. Now let's just time out. Okay, we're still doing okay for a moment on time, but let me just time out. This is how God operates with his children. Sometimes we wrongly think that God is standing up there with a great big stick in his hand, and when we get out of line or we mess up or we have a failure or we go back on a promise we made to God, that he's just looking to bang us over the head with this stick. That is not what God is doing here. God is so gracious, and he's just saying to Jacob, I'm going to make you face what you said to me so that you can deal with this in your life. I'm going to bring you back to what you said. Okay, now Jacob, look, you remember 20 years ago when you were standing right here and you saw me? You saw that ladder and you saw me there? Okay, do you remember just not long ago when I met you face to face and we had a wrestling match that night? Hey, Jacob, you know that injury that you're still walking around with? Do you remember? Yeah, Lord, I remember. Okay, now what did you say to me 20 years ago? Have you done what you said? No, I sure haven't. Okay, Jacob, you need to fix that. So he makes Jacob face himself. This is just the grace of God. And when Jacob has dealt with that in his life, then God says, now let me just remind you of the promise I made to your fathers and to you earlier. I'm your God. You're going to be a great nation. And the land that I promised Abraham and Isaac, I'm going to give to you. I'm just going to reiterate the promises that I made to you. So God gives him reassurance here, and he renews the promises that he made to Jacob. And so, same chapter, and we're nearly done here. Verse 16, they journeyed from Bethel, and there was but a little way to come to Ephrath. And notice this, and Rachel travailed, and she had hard labor. And it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said unto her, Fear not, thou shalt have this son also. And it came to pass as her soul was in departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. But Jacob called his name Benjamin, which means the son of my right hand. So Rachel died, and she was buried in the way to Ephrath, which is in Bethlehem. So they depart from Bethel, okay, and they go back down the mountain, and they're on their way now to go to where Isaac is. They're going to go see Isaac, and along the way, Rachel dies, giving birth to Benjamin. And Jacob eventually makes it to Hebron, and he sees Isaac, his father, and that's at the end of this chapter here. Notice in verse 27, and Jacob came unto Isaac, his father, unto Mamre, unto the city of Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. So Jacob finally makes it home to see his father. Okay, let me give you the last thing, and then we'll be done here today. And just look at this little chronology chart one more time. And you'll get an idea here of a little bit of the timeline. So this was similar to what we showed you at the very beginning of the study, but if you're looking now, Jacob and Esau, I realized just now that I've forgotten to put some details into that. So the only thing you see is Isaac dies. How's that for a joyful end? Okay, well, Isaac does die, but actually he doesn't die right now. He dies after they're already in Egypt, but we'll get to that later on. So this is now the story of at least Jacob finally makes it back to see his father, and this is the bulk of Jacob's life here. Okay, he's quite an old man now. Now our next study won't be next week, but after that, our next study will pick up, and the study transitions from Jacob to Joseph, and we'll look now at Joseph's life in a little bit of detail, and try to show you some of the typology here, and we'll see when Jacob dies. But the next study, I believe, one or two will get us through the end of the book of Genesis, and then it probably will only take us another 3 months to get through the book of Exodus. But we're getting there, all right? All right, thanks for your attention tonight. Why don't we pray? Lord, thank you for your word, for the